Welcome to the lecture on Fred Feldman's article, Some Puzzles About the Evil of Death. I'm Andrew Chapman. This lecture is entitled Intrinsic Value, All Things Considered Value, and Death. In this lecture, we'll discuss 7 topics. 1. Practical ethics and existentialism as related to being dead, death, and dying. 2. The philosophical and psychological questions concerning the badness of death. 3. Feldman's thesis, argument, and methodology. 4. 4 puzzles about the badness of death. 5. 2 accounts of value, intrinsic versus all things considered. 6. The badness of death and where Epicurus went wrong. And 7. Solutions to the 4 puzzles about the badness of death. Says Feldman, death is nothing to Epicureans. They do not fear or hate death. They do not view death as a misfortune for the deceased. They think death is no worse for the deceased than is not yet being born for the as yet unborn. They say that ordinary people who look forward to their deaths with dismay are in this irrational. Although some may find reassurance in the reasoning of Epicureans, most of us cannot help but view it as sophistry. Except in cases in which continued life would be unbearable, death is taken to be a misfortune for the one who dies. Fred Feldman is a professor emeritus at the University of Massachusetts at Amherst. His research interests include the history of philosophy, metaphysics, epistemology, and for much of the later part of his career, ethics. Practical ethics, which is also called applied ethics, is the subdiscipline of philosophical ethics that concerns itself with the moral properties and moral reasons surrounding specific types of actions, events, and states of affairs. The practical ethicist is primarily concerned with the moral properties possessed by specific types of actions, events, and states of affairs, but is not primarily concerned with the general ethical theory that determines those moral properties. The subdiscipline of philosophical ethics that's concerned with general ethical theory is known as normative ethics. Some, but certainly not all, of the questions asked by the practical ethicist are: what is the moral status of specific sorts of sexual activity? What is the moral status of abortion? How should we treat non-human animals? What are the right and wrong ways for a nation to conduct a war? What is the moral status of specifically race-related questions? What is the moral status of specifically gender-related questions? And what makes our specific sorts of lives go well or go badly? Questions about the goodness or badness of death, whether death is bad at all, would generally be lumped in with this final sort of question. If our lives go well for specific reasons, then they might go badly for other sorts of reasons, for example, our life ending. In understanding the scope of practical ethics, it's important for us to understand the distinction between practical ethics and what's known as existentialism. Existentialism is a philosophical and literary movement that began mainly in Germany and France in the late 19th century. Thinkers such as Soren Kierkegaard, Friedrich Nietzsche, Martin Heidegger, and Jean-Paul Sartre are among existentialism's most prominent figures. Existentialism requires a radically individualistic, although not generally self-centered or egoistic, methodology that's known as phenomenology. Existentialism is in many ways a philosophy of living, where living here refers to the specific sort of thing that self-conscious, rational creatures like us do. While practical ethics generally gives us guidelines for how to live in terms of being good human people, and thus could be considered a philosophy of living, as existentialism is considered a philosophy of living, practical ethics nearly always ignores a phenomenological methodology and is more concerned with moral principles than with individual experience. So one of the main things that separates practical ethics from existentialism is that the existentialist is concerned first and foremost with what it's like to be one of us, and then from there asks questions about how we should make use of the what it's like to be one of us, where the practical ethicist is concerned with objective moral properties seen from a third personal or dispassionate perspective. In our discussions about death, we aren't concerned with metaphysical or religious questions concerning whether, for example, persons are more than merely their bodies, or whether there's some part of a person, like a soul or an incorporeal mind, that could persist beyond bodily death. While those are very interesting questions in their own right, we shouldn't confuse them with our central topic, which is death in itself. Death, as we'll use the term here, refers to the permanent annihilation of the subject. If I die, then I'm gone. None of this is to say that any particular religion is false or any particular metaphysical questions should just be decided by fiat. We are here defining death stipulatively. We're saying this is what we mean when we talk about death. Now, if someone thinks that after bodily death we still exist in some way, then that person thinks that bodily death isn't death in the way that we are using that term. If somebody thinks that some part of us is immortal, then that person thinks that we never actually die in our sense of the word. Thus, when we talk about death here, we're referring to one and only one very specific thing, which is permanent annihilation of the subject going out of existence, the subject being no more. The philosophical concepts and terms surrounding death can be used imprecisely or equivocally, so it's important for us to be very clear with our use of concepts, namely those concepts of being dead, death, and dying. We want to make sure that we don't confuse these concepts with each other, because if we do, we might end up arguing for a conclusion that isn't supported by our premises because we have slid illegitimately from one use of a term to another. Here's how we'll use these terms in this lecture. Being dead. That's the state that one is in after one has died, after one's death. One is no longer around when they are dead. Death. That's the instant when one dies, when one passes from being alive to being dead. However, confusingly, death is also used to refer to the state of being dead, and in fact it's generally used in this second sense to refer to the state of being dead. Context generally determines whether what's being talked about is the instant when one passes from life to death, or whether it's being used to talk about being dead. Dying. That's the process that's undergone by the living, and that's a lead up to death. No dying person is dead. Now, in a poetic, metaphorical sort of way, we're all dying since we're all growing closer to death. However, usually the concept of dying is used to refer to the final bits of a living person's life. However, we're going to demarcate the final bits of a life. There are two different ways to think about the badness of death. One of them I'll call the philosophical way, the other I'll call the psychological or emotional way. Many, probably most people, think that there's something bad about death. And it's not just that death makes survivors very sad. In fact, it's the badness of death that makes people sad, rather than the other way around. But if death is actually bad, then we should be able to find some reason why death is bad. Call this the philosophical question about the badness of death. What is it, if anything, that makes death bad? One way to examine this question, and the way that has been most influential in practical philosophical studies about death, has been to look at the sorts of things that make other human endeavors bad, and then to see whether death possesses any of those things, or at least whether death possesses things that are relevantly similar to those things. Someone might say human endeavors are bad or go badly for a number of reasons. Chief among those reasons, perhaps someone is or some people are harmed, or there's a lack of some good thing that should otherwise be present, and someone is or some people are deprived of something that would be better for them not to be deprived of. The philosophical question of the badness of death is the objective question of the badness of death. Is death actually bad in itself? In addition to, and perhaps largely independent of, the philosophical question concerning the badness of death, there's also an emotional or psychological question concerning the badness of death. Many, perhaps most people, have negative emotions or psychological states about death, especially about their own death rather than about death in the abstract. These emotions or psychological states are generally related to fear and anxiety, trepidation generally. The emotional or psychological question concerning the badness of death is whether our negative emotions concerning death are apt, or instead, whether those emotions are misplaced. Now, of course, emotion is less susceptible to reason and argumentation than is belief. However, we shouldn't think that good reasons can't offer us comfort concerning something that we thought was bad, or perhaps even show us the way to feel much less bad or even good about something that we previously had negative emotions with respect to. Now, if the philosophical question concerning the badness of death is answered in a way that shows us that death is not actually bad, then it seems as though it would probably be the case that the answer to the emotional or psychological question would be that any negative feelings about death would be misplaced. If the answer to the philosophical question shows us that death actually is bad, then it's an open question whether we should feel negatively about something that is bad. Feldman nicely sums up the thesis of his paper, the argument of his paper, and the overall argumentative methodology of his paper in the conclusion. He says, I have attempted to formulate a coherent answer to the ancient challenge set by Epicurus. I have claimed that there is nothing paradoxical about the idea that death may be bad for the one who dies. My answer is a version of the traditional view that death is bad when it is bad, primarily because it deprives the deceased of goods, the goods he would have enjoyed had he lived. I have attempted to provide my answer within a predominantly Epicurean framework. I have assumed that hedonism is true, and I have assumed that when a person dies, he goes out of existence. I have attempted to show that even if we grant these assumptions, we can still maintain that death can be evil for the deceased. I have furthermore attempted to show that if we formulate our account properly, we can provide satisfactory answers to some puzzling questions. How can death be bad for the deceased if he doesn't exist when it occurs? When is death bad for the deceased? Is there an illegitimate comparison between the welfare of the non-existent and the welfare of the existent? Why is death worse than prenatal non-existence? Along the way, I have also discussed the merits of some other proposed solutions to the puzzles. In order to understand Feldman's starting point for his argument in his paper, we need to understand the theses of Epicurus and a later Epicurean named Lucretius when it comes to death and whether death is bad and how death would be bad if it were bad. Epicurus and Lucretius, both Epicureans, of course, Epicurus is an Epicurean, Lucretius is a later follower of Epicurus's philosophy. Both these philosophers adopt theories of what makes something good or bad, according to which something can only be bad for a person if that person experiences that thing as bad. According to Epicurus, death is nothing to us since when we are dead, we aren't around anymore to experience death, and hence death couldn't possibly be bad for us. According to Lucretius, we correctly recognize that prenatal, pre-birth non-existence isn't bad, and so we also ought to recognize that post-death non-existence isn't bad. Epicurus's and Lucretius's claims can be seen as claims about both the philosophical and psychological or emotional questions about the badness of death. Death isn't actually bad, and, hence, we oughtn't have negative psychological states about death. This is Feldman's starting point. According to Feldman, the Epicurean in effect presents the person who thinks that death is a bad thing for the one who dies, with 4 puzzles about the badness of death. These puzzles are: 1. How can death be bad for the deceased if he doesn't exist when it occurs? 2. If death is bad for the deceased, then when is death bad for the deceased? 3. If someone's claiming that death is bad for the deceased, then is there an illegitimate comparison being made between the welfare of the non-existent and the welfare of the existent? And finally, if death is bad, then why is death worse than prenatal non-existence? Epicureanism about value and how value attaches to people and people's lives is a form of the doctrine known as hedonism. And Epicureanism holds that the only things that are fundamentally valuable are pleasure and pain. If anything else is valuable, it's valuable because of its relation to pleasure and pain. Pleasure is positively valuable and pain is negatively valuable or of disvalue. Both of them have a sort of value to them. The good sort of value is attached to pleasure, and the negative or bad sort of value or disvalue is attached to pain. Epicureanism also accepts what's known as the existence condition on value. Something can't be of value or disvalue to a person at a time unless that person exists at that time. The existence condition is a necessary condition on value, since existing at some time is necessary or required for a person to have value or disvalue at that time. However, the existence condition is not a sufficient condition on value, since merely existing doesn't on its own guarantee value or disvalue. Sets the stage for value or disvalue, and without it, value and disvalue are impossible. What's known as the deprivation account of the badness of death holds that if death is a bad thing for a person, then it's bad because death deprives that person of certain valuable things. Clearly, then, the deprivation account directly conflicts with Epicureanism, since the deprivation account denies the existence condition. Not existing is not a problem for the badness of death, says the deprivation account. In fact, not existing is precisely what makes it possible for death to be a bad thing. As Feldman has told us, his account of the badness of death is a version of the deprivation account. Hence, Feldman must find some way, plausibly, to deny the existence condition. Here's how he does it. According to Feldman, Epicureanism has gone wrong in that it holds that there is only one type of value that's relevant to the badness of death. In fact, says Feldman, there are two types of value. The first is known as intrinsic value. Intrinsic value for some person is value of which that person is the recipient or subject at some particular time. This sort of value is non-relational in that its valuable or disvaluable properties are had by it, not in relation to some other thing. So, for example, a state of pain at a particular time is intrinsically negatively valuable. Pain is on its own of disvalue. It's not of disvalue in relation to some other thing. The second type of value is known as all things considered value. All things considered value of some situation for some person is value that situation has for that person in comparison to the value of some other possible but non-actual situation for that person. This sort of value is relational in that the value of a situation for a person is derived from a comparison between that situation and some other possible but non-actual situation. In order to understand Feldman's notion of all things considered value, we'll need to understand the notion of possible worlds. Now, possible worlds have a number of different metaphysical theories that attempt to make sense of them. The particular metaphysics of possible worlds needn't concern us here. What needs to concern us generally is what possible worlds are supposed to be and what they do. For our purposes, a possible world is a large proposition, a large description that fully describes some total way that things might have been or are, including all facts about the past, present, and future. It's important to recognize here that the actual world is a possible world. We know that the actual world is possible because here it is. So the full description of what's going on in the actual world is also a possible world. But there are many different possible worlds, perhaps infinitely many, that are non-actual, that describe things not as they are, but as they could be. We can also talk about a person existing in a possible world. That doesn't need to sound spooky, that just means that the person has true counterfactual claims about them and counterfactual propositions related to those counterfactual claims. Possible worlds can also be more or less similar to one another. The more different stuff there is between two possible worlds, the more dissimilar they are, the less similar they are. We can talk about the nearness or farness of two possible worlds with respect to each other in terms of how similar those worlds are. If two worlds are near to one another, then they're very similar. If two worlds are far away from one another, then they're very dissimilar. It should be obvious that things can be bad for people and things can be good for people. Says Feldman, if death is bad for a person, then it's bad in the same way that other things are bad for that person. He says it would be very strange if we needed a different account of badness in order to make sense of the badness of death. We've also seen that something can be bad intrinsically or bad in an all things considered way. If P, some state of affairs or circumstance or situation or fact, is intrinsically bad for some person, S, then S is the subject or the recipient of P. The only thing that can be intrinsically bad on a hedonic axiology, that is, a theory about what makes things good and bad that's attached to hedonism. The only thing that can be intrinsically bad on a hedonic axiology is pain. On the other hand, if P, some situation or circumstance or state of affairs or fact, is all things considered bad for a person, S, then S is worse off given P than given not P. That means if P happens, then S is worse off than S would have been if P had not happened. Now, something can be intrinsically neutral and all things considered bad, or it can be intrinsically bad and all things considered neutral or positive. So, for example, think you might have to go to the dentist and it might be very painful to get work done on your teeth. So that is intrinsically bad according to a hedonic axiology. However, you would have been worse off if you had not gone to the dentist. So going to the dentist, even though it is intrinsically bad, is all things considered good or positive. Now, since it's very important to get clear on what it means to say that something is all things considered bad or all things considered good, we should give a formal definition of all things considered badness and goodness. In this formal definition, the following variables and symbols mean the following things. P is just some state of affairs, some situation. S, that's a variable for any person. The backwards E, that's a quantifier, a logical term that means there exists. W is some possible world. W prime is a possible world that's different from W. A P world is a possible world in which P occurs. A not P world, or a tilde P world, is a possible world in which P does not occur. And V parentheses S comma W means the value for person S in world W. Here are our definitions. P would be good for S in an all things considered sense, if and only if there exists a world W and there exists a world W prime where W is the nearest world in which P happens and W prime is the nearest world in which P does not happen, and the value for S in W is greater than the value for S in W prime. So P's good if, had P not happened, S would have been worse off value-wise. On the other hand, P would be bad for S if and only if there exists a possible world W and there exists a possible world W prime where W is the nearest P world where P happens, and W prime is the nearest not P world where P does not happen, and the value in W for S is less than the value for S in W prime. So this says that P would be bad if and only if, had P not happened, S would have been better off. And so we can combine these two together to get an overall definition of the value, all things considered, of a situation for a person. The value for S of P equals some number n if and only if there exists a possible world W, there exists a possible world W prime, where W is the nearest world where P happens, and W prime is the nearest world where P does not happen, and the value for S in W minus the value for S in W prime equals n. When we subtract the value for S in the world where P does not happen from the value for S in the world where P does happen, we get some number. Might be positive, might be negative, might just be 0, and that number tells us the value of P for S. So here's just a quick demonstration of what was going on in those formal definitions. Here's you at the top of the screen, happy. Consider some situation P. If P occurs, then that would put you in world W, the closest P world. If P doesn't occur, then that would put you in W prime, the closest not P world. So if P occurs, we can determine the value of P occurring for you by looking at how valuable things are for you in that world, which is just V parentheses SW, the value in S, that's you, of the world, W. If P doesn't occur, and you go over to W prime, our not P world, then we can determine the value for you there. That's just the value of S, that's you, in W prime. So while there are a number of variables here and some logical terms, don't get confused and think that this is all that difficult to understand. When we're trying to figure out how valuable something is for you, we just look at how valuable things would be for you if the thing happened, and we compare it to how valuable things would be for you if the thing didn't happen. We always have to compare the two situations together because we don't know how things would be for you if the thing didn't happen. We can't just look at what would happen if the thing did happen. We need to compare it to the opposite situation where it doesn't happen. Now here's an example of all of this from Feldman. He says, suppose that if Dolores were to move to Bolivia, the rest of her life would be a nightmare. Considering all the pleasures and pains she would ever experience, including the ones she has already experienced, her life would be worth maybe plus 100 points. Thus, the value for Dolores of the nearest world in which she moves to Bolivia is plus 100. Suppose, on the other hand, that the value for her of the nearest world in which she does not move to Bolivia is plus 1,000. Then she would be 900 units worse off if she were to move to Bolivia. That tells us precisely how bad it would be for her to move to Bolivia. The value for her of moving to Bolivia is negative 900. So the general principle says that to find the value for a person of a state of affairs, subtract the value for him of the nearest world where it does not obtain from the value for him of the nearest world where it does obtain. And now, of course, don't think that we actually have to be able to figure out the precise values here. Feldman is just giving us a framework for seeing that things can be, all things considered, valuable, and this is how we would determine the precise value if we could get these precise numbers. So don't confuse the question of us actually figuring it out with the question of whether there is value there at all. Feldman says death is bad when a person would be, all things considered, better if she didn't die, when the value of her life in the closest possible world in which she doesn't die is higher than in the world in which she does die. Hence, most deaths are bad for the person who dies. For most people, had they not died when they in fact do die, their lives would have been, all things considered, better. This has nothing to do with claiming that being dead is a bad sort of experience. It's not an experience at all. This has to do with comparing the possible world in which somebody dies with the closest possible world, the most similar possible world in which they don't die, and finding the latter to be better in terms of all things considered value for that particular person. And note that death is not always bad for the one who dies, just most of the time. Feldman's proposal, however, gives us a way of making sense of how death could actually be good if the person is suffering, where Epicurus's proposal doesn't give us any option of making sense of how death could be good for the one who dies, since an end to suffering is neither good nor bad, according to Epicurus's proposal. So it's not just, as Epicurus says, that death is nothing to us and that means that death isn't bad. Even further, death is never good. According to Feldman, Epicurus went wrong in his argument by only considering the intrinsic value of death. Since death has no intrinsic value, Epicurus correctly concluded that death is therefore not intrinsically bad for the one who dies. Although, as we just noted, it's not intrinsically good for the one who dies either. It's nothing for the one who dies. However, the fact that something is not intrinsically bad for someone doesn't mean that it's not all things considered bad for that person. There's more to the value of a life than the mere intrinsic value of specific states. And the hedonist can say that there is a distinction between intrinsic and all things considered value without having to give up hedonism. Nowhere here does this say that the things that are ultimately valuable are not states of pleasure and pain. What this is denying is the existence condition, not the claim that if something is good or if something is bad, it's good or bad in a fundamental sense because of its relationship to states of pleasure and pain. And another possibility for where Epicurus went wrong, or probably a second way that Epicurus went wrong, is that the Epicurean also thinks that something can only be good or bad for a person if it causes something intrinsically bad for that person. But since, after a person's death, nothing can be caused for that person, then nothing can be good or bad for that person. But again, note that this proposal leaves all things considered badness out completely. So, overall, Epicurus's problem is leaving out all things considered badness. Let's now turn to the four puzzles that Feldman presented us with at the beginning. Remember that these are four puzzles that anybody who claims that death is bad for the person who dies needs to solve. The first puzzle is, how can death be bad for the deceased if he doesn't exist when it occurs? Says Feldman, it can be bad for the deceased because a state of affairs can be bad for a person when they exist, before they exist, or after they exist, so long as it changes the overall value of that person's life as compared to the closest possible world in which that situation did not occur. The sort of value that's relevant to this question is all things considered value and not intrinsic value. This puzzle is only a puzzle if we assume both that the only sort of value is intrinsic value and that the existence condition applies to every sort of value. But both of these assumptions are false, and we can make sense of the badness of death in terms of all things considered value, to which the existence condition doesn't apply. The second puzzle asks, when is death bad for the deceased? This might appear to be a puzzle because it would seem that a person's death isn't bad during her life, since she hasn't yet died, and it would seem that her death isn't bad for her when she's dead, since nothing is bad for her when she's dead. But again, this is to assume both that intrinsic value is the only sort of value and that the existence condition holds. To see the answer to this question, consider a related question. When is the value of $5 more than the value of $1? Now, we might say, well, always, but it seems like more than just always. The value is eternally more. So either the value is like that at every moment in time, or temporal notions don't even make sense when we talk about value, in the same way that spatial notions don't make sense. If somebody asked, where is the value of $5 more than the value of $1, we might be confused. So in answer to this puzzle, the badness of death is eternally bad, not at any particular time. It's not bad at any specific moment, but it's either always bad or even transtemporally bad. It just doesn't make sense to talk about the badness of death in terms of specific times. The third puzzle asks us, is there an illegitimate comparison being made between the welfare of the non-existent and the welfare of the existent? The claim that there's an illegitimate comparison being made assumes that what must be compared here is the state of life and the state of death. But since there is no such thing as the state of death, this would be an illegitimate comparison. So this assumption that there's an illegitimate comparison being made here is false. It's not that when someone is dead, there is badness about the state of death, and that badness is illegitimately being compared to the goodness of life. That would be to assume both that there's only one type of value, intrinsic value, and to assume the truth of the existence condition. What's being compared on Feldman's account is two lives, not a life and a death. The two lives that are being compared are the actual life with the actual death that it has, and the closest possible life in which the person died later than they did in the actual world. So this third puzzle rests on a confusion. Two things are being compared, but it is not the same person in their state of life and in their state of death in the same possible situation. It's the same person in two different possible situations. One is the one that actually happened, in which they died when they did. The other is one that might have happened but didn't, in which they died later. The situation in which they died later will generally be better, and so that situation will be more valuable positively for the person who died, and hence death will be bad for that person. The fourth puzzle asks us, why is death worse than prenatal, pre-birth, non-existence? The value is of the entire life compared to another possible life, not of a life compared to an earlier life, says Feldman. The problem isn't specifically here about death, but about the length of life, if length corresponds generally with value. If someone is going to live for 75 years, whether they're born now or 10 years from now, not being born now doesn't negatively affect them. But if they would have lived for 85 years rather than 75 years if they hadn't died now, then that does negatively affect them. So there's an actual asymmetry between birth and death, and this is what brings about the asymmetry between the badness of death and the non-badness of prenatal non-existence. This asymmetry piggybacks on the asymmetry between the past and the future, says Feldman. When I am asked to consider what would happen if some person, for example, Claudette, were to die later, I hold her birth date constant. It has already occurred, and I tend to think that unnecessary differences in past history are big differences between worlds. Thus, it is more natural for me to suppose that if she were to die later, it would be because she lives longer. On the other hand, when I'm asked to consider what would have happened if she had been born earlier, I don't hold her death date constant. Instead, I hold her lifespan constant and adjust the death date so as to accommodate itself to the earlier birth date. So moving someone's death date and moving someone's birth date are not symmetrical with one another. To move someone's birth date doesn't give them any more life. To move someone's death date does. In this lecture, we've looked at 7 topics. 1. Practical ethics and existentialism as related to being dead, death, and dying. 2. The philosophical and psychological questions concerning the badness of death. 3. Feldman's thesis, argument, and methodology. 4. 4 puzzles about the badness of death. 5. 2 accounts of value, intrinsic versus all things considered value. 6. The badness of death and where Epicurus went wrong. And 7. Solutions to the 4 puzzles about the badness of death. Thank you.